1985 looked like any normal Soviet year. The stores were empty, but they had always been empty. The buildings were crumbling, but they had always been crumbling. The faces in the queues were tired, but fatigue was just the national expression. Nobody standing in the breadlines of Moscow or the freezing bus stops of Sverdlovsk knew the truth. They didn't know they were living in a dead empire walking. They didn't know they had 6 years left. To understand why the Colossus fell, you have to look past the history books that tell you 1985 was the start of the reform, the year of Mikhail Gorbachev, the year the light finally came in. Those books are wrong. 1985 wasn't a beginning, it was an ending. It was the terminal diagnosis of the old world. It was the year the Soviet system's immune system finally turned against itself, triggering a cascade of hidden nuclear explosions, secret mountain massacres, and a suicidal war on the one thing that made life bearable for the average worker: vodka. The color of 1985 is monochromatic blue and gray. It is a high-contrast, brittle image, like a window pane that is about to snap. You are standing in a courtyard in the Moscow suburbs. It is January. The wind whistles through the concrete gaps of the high-rise blocks, a sound that every Soviet citizen knows better than their own national anthem. Frost patterns cover the cracked glass. A Lada is buried under snow, looking more like a grave marker than a vehicle. The only sign of warmth in the entire frozen city is the steam rising from a manhole cover, a faint breath from the dying industrial beast beneath the pavement. While Western observers were fixated on the Kremlin's succession drama, wondering who would sit on the throne next, the most significant event of early 1985 was taking place in the basements and boiler rooms of these suburbs. The winter of 1984 to 1985 was historically severe. Temperatures in Moscow plunged to record lows, part of a massive Arctic outbreak that froze the entire northern hemisphere. But the Soviet Union was supposed to be a civilization built on the conquest of winter. Cold was not an excuse here, it was a challenge. Yet, in the industrial city of Podolsk, just south of the capital, the challenge was being lost. A catastrophic failure of the district heating system left thousands of residents without heat in sub-zero temperatures. In the Soviet Union, heating was not an individual responsibility. You couldn't just go to the basement and fix your furnace. Heat was a state-provided utility, delivered via massive centralized steam pipes from industrial plants. It was a fundamental social contract. You give the state your labor and your loyalty, and the state keeps you from freezing to death. When the pipes in Podolsk burst, it wasn't just a plumbing issue, it was a breach of that contract. Residents reported indoor temperatures dropping to 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine sitting in your kitchen, wearing your winter coat, watching your breath fog in the air. You call the local authorities? Silence, paralysis. A resident named Yelena reported, "We are sending complaints everywhere, but no one listens to us." She described portable heaters working in every room, clinics and kindergartens with no heating at all. This was the hidden rot of the era of stagnation finally breaking through the surface. The infrastructure laid down during the rapid urbanization of the Khrushchev and early Brezhnev eras was reaching the end of its operational life cycle simultaneously. The central planning system, obsessed with new construction quotas to look good on paper, had chronically underinvested in maintenance. Now, the bill was due. The widespread use of electric heaters by freezing residents threatened to crash the electrical grid, creating a cascading infrastructure failure that local bureaucrats were too terrified to report up the chain of command. But to really understand why the heat wasn't working in Podolsk, you have to look 20 miles west to the Kuntsevo district, specifically to the heavily guarded gates of the Central Clinical Hospital. Behind 10-foot walls and KGB checkpoints, the most powerful man in the Eastern Bloc was dying. Again. Konstantin Chernenko, the general secretary, had been a ghost for months. By early 1985, the leader of the superpower was essentially a biological subject kept alive by the state's best doctors. His medical chart was a catalog of terminal conditions: severe emphysema, an enlarged and damaged heart, congestive heart failure, and liver cirrhosis.
His breathing was so labored that during his rare television appearances, audio engineers had to dampen the sound of his wheezing just to make the broadcast usable.
The entire superpower was on pause, waiting for the old man to die. Diplomats in Moscow played a grim game called car counting. Traffic police were stationed every quarter mile on the road to Konsevo. If you saw a sudden increase in the density of these patrols or a flurry of black ZIL limousines gliding silently over the snow, you knew the leader was fading. They watched the TV schedule obsessively. If the station played classical music instead of the evening news, the leader was dead. If they played Swan Lake, the government was fallen. The Kremlin went to extraordinary lengths to mask this incapacitation, creating a surreal atmosphere in global geopolitics. On February 24, 1985, just weeks before his death, state television staged a voting ceremony. It was a complete fabrication. The hospital room was dressed to look like a polling station. Chernenko, pale and trembling, could barely hold the ballot paper. The camera angles were carefully chosen to hide the medical equipment just out of frame. When he failed to meet the visiting Greek prime minister, officials claimed he had a cold, when in reality he was likely comatose. This period was known as the time of funerals. Brezhnev died in 82, Andropov in 84. Now, in the freezing spring of 85, Chernenko was gasping his last breaths. For 3 years, the Soviet population saw their leaders only as frail, dying men. This delegitimized the party more effectively than any dissident propaganda ever could. It primed the public for anyone who could simply walk up a flight of stairs without assistance.
On March 10, 1985, at 7:20 p.m., Chernenko's heart finally stopped. For 4 hours, the death was a state secret. The phones in the Politburo villas started ringing. They gathered in the Kremlin, the old guard, men in their 70s and 80s, their chests heavy with medals. Gromyko, Tikhonov, Grishin. They looked at each other across the polished wood tables and knew they couldn't do this again. They couldn't elect another corpse. The world was laughing. The economy was bleeding. They needed a face that looked like it had blood in its veins. They looked to the youngest man in the room, Mikhail Gorbachev, 54 years old. In that room, he was practically a toddler. He spoke without reading from a paper. He smiled. He had a wife, Raisa, who bought stylish clothes. On March 11th, the announcement was made. The old guard signed their own death warrant, thinking they were just hiring a new manager. Andrei Gromyko, the grim foreign minister known as Mr. No, nominated him. He told the room, "This man has a nice smile, but he has teeth of iron." He was half right. The archives reveal this wasn't inevitable history. It was a calculated gamble by a ruling class that felt the ground shaking. They voted for the reformer because they believed he could modernize the economy without touching the ideology. They thought they were getting a tune-up. They didn't know the engine was rusted through. Gorbachev was a true believer. He wasn't a secret Democrat. He was a Leninist who believed the system was fundamentally sound. He believed that if you removed the corruption and the alcohol, the machine would work. And that belief led him to make his first, and perhaps most fatal, mistake. He saw the low productivity, he saw the men sleeping at their factory machines, and he identified a culprit. It wasn't the Central Planning Committee, it wasn't the lack of incentives, it was the bottle.
Gorbachev saw the rot, and he decided to cut it out with a rusty knife. In May 1985, just 2 months into his reign, he launched the campaign that would define the early days of his leadership, the anti-alcohol campaign. The decree was titled Measures to Overcome Drunkenness and Alcoholism. It sounds bureaucratic, boring even, but on the ground, it was a declaration of war against the Soviet population. The goal was noble. Alcoholism was decimating the Soviet male workforce. Life expectancy was dropping. Men were drinking themselves to death in their 40s. But the execution was a lobotomy. The state didn't just raise prices or launch public health PSAs. They went to war with the culture itself.
In the southern republics of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, a tragedy was unfolding that had nothing to do with drinking and everything to do with cultural erasure. These regions had been producing wine for centuries. It was their heritage, their pride. In the summer of 1985, under orders from Moscow to show compliance with the new leader, local officials sent bulldozers into the vineyards. They tore up pristine vines that had stood for generations. It was economic vandalism. Gorbachev earned a new nickname on the street, the Mineral Secretary. It was a joke whispered in kitchens, but the punchline was devastating. By declaring war on vodka, Gorbachev had accidentally declared war on the Soviet economy.
You have to understand the math of the Soviet budget to see the scale of this suicide. The Soviet Union ran on two things: oil exports and alcohol taxes. In 1979, the state collected 25.4 billion rubles in indirect taxes from alcohol. That was more than they collected from income taxes. By slashing production and closing liquor stores, between 1984 and 1987, the number of stores selling alcohol was cut by 5 times. Gorbachev voluntarily deleted nearly 20% of the state budget. He did this at the exact moment global oil prices were beginning to soften, threatening the other pillar of the economy. It was the equivalent of a person quitting their job on the same day their house burned down, thinking it would help them focus on self-improvement. State alcohol sales fell by 5 billion rubles in just the first year. The treasury began to bleed. But you cannot legislate thirst. The sobering of the nation was a myth. The only thing that sobered up was the treasury. When the state stopped selling vodka, the laws of supply and demand didn't vanish. They just went underground.
Enter Samagon, moonshine. Suddenly, in the summer of 1985, sugar disappeared from the shelves of Moscow. It vanished from Sverdlovsk. It was gone in Kyiv. Why? Because sugar is the primary ingredient you need to distill vodka in your bathtub. The demand for alcohol shifted instantly to the raw materials. In Moscow, per capita sugar consumption spiked so violently that the state, a nuclear superpower, was forced to ration sugar. Imagine the humiliation. This wasn't a harvest failure. This wasn't a war shortage. This was a shortage caused by millions of people panic buying sugar to brew illegal liquor in their kitchens. While official state alcohol sales dropped by 63%, illegal Samagon production surged by an estimated 140%. The police were playing whack-a-mole. You could smell the yeast in the stairwells of the apartment blocks. The state wasn't stopping the drinking, they were just losing the revenue from it. And then it got darker. Sugar was hard to find, but chemical products were still available. The desperate turned to surrogates. This is the part of 1985 that the propaganda posters didn't show. People began drinking industrial alcohol, window cleaner, and cologne. There was a specific brand called Troinoy, triple cologne. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was 64% alcohol. It smelled like perfume, but it hit like a hammer. Other lotions contained up to 97% ethanol, along with toxic additives like aldehydes and heavy metals. The hospitals began to fill up not with drunks, but with poisoning victims. They came in blind, their livers failing, their skin yellow. The death toll from alcohol poisoning didn't stop, it just changed flavor. The campaign alienated the working class base the party relied on. It created a cynical distance between the Kremlin dreamers who thought they could fix society by decree and the street where men were drinking eau de cologne to numb the reality of their existence.
But while the men of Moscow were poisoning themselves with perfume, 3,000 kilometers away, a different kind of poisoning was taking place, a literal bleeding wound that had been open for 6 years. Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan War was supposed to be a limited contingent. It was supposed to be a quick intervention to prop up a friendly socialist government. By 1985, it had become a meat grinder. And in April of that year, while Gorbachev was still settling into his office, a tragedy occurred that exposed the limits of Soviet power to its own soldiers. The place was the Kunar province, the Maravar Pass.
On April 21, 1985, a unit of elite Spetsnaz, the Soviet Special Forces, was deployed to the gorge, the first company of the 334th Spetsnaz Detachment. These weren't conscripts. These were the best the USSR had. They had just arrived in Afghanistan a month earlier, fresh and confident. Their mission was to hunt down Mujahideen fighters in the village of Sangam. It was supposed to be a routine sweep. They moved into the gorge, the jagged peaks towering above them, blocking out the sun. They didn't know they were walking into a kill box. The Mujahideen, led by commanders who knew every rock and crevice of the terrain, weren't running. They were waiting. They let the Soviets move deep into the gorge, past the villages of Sangam and Daridam. Then they sealed the entrance. From the high ridges, heavy machine guns, DSHKs, opened up. The sound in a canyon is deafening. It echoes off the walls, making it impossible to tell where the fire is coming from. The Spetsnaz were trapped. Captain Nikolai Sebruk, the company commander, realized too late that they had been outmaneuvered.
The battle wasn't a firefight, it was a slaughter. Sebruk engaged in close-quarters combat and was killed by a bullet to the throat. 31 Spetsnaz soldiers died that day. These were the super soldiers of the Soviet Empire, the men who were supposed to be invincible, and they were being picked off like targets in a shooting gallery. The horror of Maravar Pass wasn't just the death toll, it was how they died. Many of the soldiers, realizing they were surrounded and out of ammunition, chose to blow themselves up with their last grenades rather than be captured. They knew what the insurgents did to prisoners. This event, the destruction of the Maravar Company, shattered the myth of invincibility within the ranks. But the Soviet public knew nothing about it. In 1985, the war was officially a peacekeeping mission. The word war was banned in the press. The bodies of the boys who died at Maravar were returned to the Soviet Union in sealed zinc coffins. The families were often forbidden from opening them. Mothers were told their sons died of food poisoning or accidents or simply fulfilling their internationalist duty. Imagine being a mother in a Soviet apartment block. Your son is sent away to a place you can barely find on a map. He comes back in a metal box you aren't allowed to touch, and the government tells you he died of bad food. This gap between the reality of the slaughter and the official silence began to corrode the loyalty of the military families, a key pillar of the state. 1985 was the bloodiest year of the war. The leadership, frustrated by the stalemate, ordered more aggressive, large-scale offensives. They were trying to force a military solution before Gorbachev's political solution could take hold. It didn't work. It just filled more zinc coffins. But the incompetence wasn't limited to the mountains of Afghanistan or the liquor stores of Moscow. It was infecting the very atoms of the Soviet defense industry. While the families of the Spetsnaz wept over sealed coffins, another group of men were about to die in a flash of blue light. This time, the enemy wasn't the Mujahideen. It was physics. And this time, the explosion wouldn't happen in a foreign land, but in a secret naval base close to foreigners, just miles from a major Soviet city. The date is August 10th, 1985. The location is Chazhma Bay, and what is about to happen there will make the heating failure in Podolsk look like a minor inconvenience. In a totalitarian state, bad news doesn't travel, it festers. It's August 10th, 1985. You are standing on the pier at Chazhma Bay, a secret naval shipyard near Vladivostok. This place doesn't exist on civilian maps. It is closed to foreigners. The air smells of salt and diesel. Docked in front of you is the K-431, a nuclear-powered Echo II class submarine. It looks terrifying, a predator of the deep. But right now, it's vulnerable. The crew is performing a refueling operation. This is open-heart surgery for a submarine. They have to lift the massive lid of the reactor core to replace the fuel rods. It requires surgical precision. The lid weighs 12 tons. It must be lifted straight up, millimeter by millimeter. But it's 1985. The era of discipline is over. The era of cutting corners has begun. The crew is rushing. They are ignoring safety protocols because the protocols are too much trouble.
The locking beam that is supposed to secure the lid hasn't been attached properly. Suddenly, a torpedo boat speeds through the harbor. It shouldn't be there, or at least it shouldn't be going that fast. Its wake hits the side of the K-431. The submarine rocks, just a little, but it's enough. Inside the reactor compartment, the rocking motion causes the control rods, which regulate the nuclear reaction, to be lifted too high. In a fraction of a second, the reactor goes prompt critical. Those standing on the pier see a blinding flash of blue light, Cherenkov radiation. Then a hissing roar. The thermal explosion blows the 12-ton reactor lid into the sky like a tossed coin. It lands 50 meters away. The explosion instantly kills 10 sailors. Their bodies are destroyed so completely that hardly anything is left to bury. But the explosion isn't the worst part. The blast releases a cloud of radioactive gas, cobalt-60 and iodine-131. A plume 650 meters wide and 3.5 kilometers long begins to drift over the water. It moves toward the shipyard workers. It moves toward the nearby town of Shkodovo 22. The reaction from Moscow is immediate, but not in the way you'd hope. They don't send help, they send silence. They cut the phone lines to the town. They set up roadblocks. The residents see the smoke, they see the commotion, but they are told nothing. They stand in their gardens, watching the fire, breathing in the isotopes, unaware that their thyroids are absorbing the poison. This was the dress rehearsal for the apocalypse. 8 months before the world learned the name Chernobyl, the Soviet Union had already nuked its own people and got away with it. The accident was classified. The world wouldn't know about it until the 1990s. If the Chazhma Bay accident had been public, if the failure of those safety protocols had been analyzed, the defects in the Soviet nuclear culture might have been exposed. The safety procedures for the RBMK reactors might have been reviewed. Instead, the silence of 1985 directly contributed to the catastrophe of 1986. The system proved it would rather poison its citizens than admit a mistake. While the submarine burned in the east, another disaster was unfolding at the bottom of the world, one that was less radioactive, but just as symbolic. In the endless white desert of Antarctica, a bright red ship sat motionless. It was the Mikhail Gorbachev, a massive Soviet icebreaker. These ships were the pride of the fleet, built to smash through the frozen oceans, proving that Soviet steel could conquer nature itself. But in early 1985, nature fought back. The Gorbachev became trapped in heavy pack ice. It wasn't just stuck, it was imprisoned. For 133 days, the ship and its crew, led by Captain Valentin Rudchenko, drifted aimlessly off the coast of Antarctica. The crew sat in the freezing dark, the steel hull groaning under the immense pressure of the ice. They were running out of fuel. They were waiting for a thaw that wasn't coming. Back in the USSR, Save the Gorbachev became a national obsession. It was on the news every night. It was framed as a heroic struggle. But if you looked closer, it was a perfect metaphor for the entire country. A massive steel behemoth, built for a different era, now paralyzed by the environment it was supposed to dominate. Drifting with no direction, unable to move forward, unable to turn back, just waiting for a rescue that seemed impossible. While the engineers fought the ice and the radiation, a silent disaster was unfolding in the one place that couldn't be fixed with a welding torch, the ledgers of the state bank. To the outside world, the Soviet economy was a fortress, but inside the Ministry of Finance, the accountants knew the terrifying truth. The Soviet Union was a superpower with a dirty secret. It was a junkie. Its drug of choice was petrodollars. For a decade, high oil prices had masked the rot. The USSR pumped oil from Siberia, sold it to the West for hard currency, and used that cash to buy the one thing its collective farms couldn't produce enough of: food. By 1985, the Soviet Union, the largest country on Earth with the most arable land, had become the world's largest importer of grain. They were buying over 50 million metric tons of wheat annually. And who were they buying it from? Their arch enemy, the United States. Think about the absurdity. The Soviet Union was pointing nuclear missiles at America with one hand and writing checks to American farmers with the other. The CIA noted that Soviet meat production goals could not be met without these imports. The superpower was effectively eating American grain to keep its population placated with sausage.
And then, in 1985, the math stopped working. This is what economists call the scissors crisis. Picture a graph. One line is the price of oil. In 1985, it was hovering around $27 to $30 a barrel. It was softening, stagnating. The revenue line was flatlining. Now, picture the other line, the cost of maintaining the empire. It was shooting up. The war in Afghanistan was costing billions. The subsidies to keep Eastern Europe loyal were fixed. The grain imports were non-negotiable. If you stopped buying grain, the people starved, and the people rioted. The lines were crossing. The scissors were closing. To pay for the grain as oil revenues stagnated, the USSR began to do something desperate. They started liquidating the family silver. In 1985, Soviet gold sales to the West jumped to roughly 210 to 250 tons. They were emptying the vaults just to buy bread. The external debt began to climb. In 1985, it was $28.9 billion. It was the year the credit cards started getting maxed out. Gorbachev and his reformers thought they could borrow their way out of the slump. They thought they could buy time. But they didn't know that the floor was about to drop out. They were selling gold and borrowing billions, assuming oil would stay at $30. They didn't know that in just a few months, the Saudis would open the taps and the price would crash to below $10. But even before the crash, the cultural bankruptcy was already complete. The state could buy wheat, it could fix ships, but it couldn't buy the one thing it had lost completely: the attention of its own children. While the Politburo was worrying about gold reserves, the youth of the Soviet Union had already defected. They hadn't defected to America, they had defected to a different reality. And the weapons they used weren't guns, they were cassette tapes. The state controlled the nuclear reactors, it controlled the vodka production, it controlled the news broadcasts. But by late 1985, it realized it had lost control of something far more dangerous: the cassette tape. While the KGB could secure the borders, they couldn't stop the airwaves, and they certainly couldn't stop the magnetizdat, the underground network of bootleg music distribution. In 1985, a new enemy had infiltrated the Soviet Union. It wasn't the CIA, it was rock and roll. In a panic, the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, issued a frantic, typewritten document to dance halls and youth clubs across the Union. It was a list of banned musical groups. Today, reading it feels like a fever dream of bureaucratic paranoia. The document didn't just ban bands, it gave reasons, and those reasons revealed a regime that had completely lost touch with reality. AC/DC? Banned. Reason given? Neo-fascism. Pink Floyd? Banned. Reason? Distortion of Soviet foreign policy. But the list got stranger. Julio Iglesias, the Spanish crooner known for soft romantic ballads? Banned. The charge? Neo-fascism. Donna Summer, the queen of disco? Banned for eroticism. The officials who wrote these lists were trying to build a dam against a tsunami with a piece of paper. They were trying to legislate cool. But the youth didn't care about the Komsomol's list. They retreated into the shadows. It is a Friday night in Leningrad, 1985. You are walking into a drab apartment building. You climb the stairs to the 5th floor. The door opens, and you are hit with a wall of cigarette smoke and heat. This is a kvartirnik, an underground apartment concert. In the corner, a man with a guitar is singing about aluminum cucumbers and electric trains. It might be Victor Tsoi and his band Kino. The lyrics aren't explicitly anti-Soviet. They are worse. They are a-Soviet. They simply pretend the state doesn't exist.
The party is speaking to an empty room. The ideology that fueled the revolution of 1917 had officially died in the hearts of the generation of 1985. And nothing proved this death more than the genes index. If you want to understand why the Soviet economy failed, forget the oil charts for a moment and look at a teenager's legs. In 1985, a pair of authentic Western jeans, Levi's, Montana, or Wrangler, was the ultimate status symbol. But you couldn't buy them in a store. You had to buy them from a fartotchik, a black market speculator, in a dark alley or a hotel lobby. The price? Roughly 200 rubles. Now, do the math. The average monthly salary of a Soviet engineer, a person with a university degree and a respected job, was between 150 and 200 rubles. A pair of pants cost more than a month of honest, educated labor. This simple economic fact destroyed the social contract. It taught an entire generation that working for the state was a sucker's game. If you wanted the good life, if you wanted to look like a human being, you had to break the law. You had to engage in the black market. The genes index criminalized the youth and delegitimized the value of the ruble before hyperinflation ever hit. Soviet kids were willing to starve for a month just to look like Americans.
By the autumn of 1985, the unraveling was visible everywhere, if you knew where to look. The system was trapped in a paradox of its own making. Gorbachev, sensing the stagnation, began pushing his policy of uskorenia, acceleration. He wanted to speed up the machine. He poured money into machine-building industries. He demanded higher quotas. He told everyone to work harder, faster, soberer. But you can't accelerate a car that has no engine oil and a cracked axle. When you speed it up, you don't go faster. You just shake the vehicle apart. In the factories, acceleration meant managers cutting corners to meet impossible new targets. It meant safety checks were skipped, like the ones at Chazhma Bay. It meant maintenance was deferred, like the pipes in Podolsk. In the liquor stores, sobriety meant the loss of tax revenue and the rise of a toxic shadow economy. In Afghanistan, resolution meant throwing more bodies into the grinder at Maravar Pass to force a victory that wasn't there. The tragic irony of 1985 is that every solution the leadership applied only accelerated the collapse. They were tightening the screws on a rusted bolt. The harder they turned, the more likely it was to snap. And yet, life went on. This is the strangest part of the collapse, the normalcy of it. People still went to work. They still rode the metro. They still watched the evening news, which told them that the harvest was bountiful and the imperialist West was decaying. There was a cognitive dissonance that hung over the country, like the smog over Magnitogorsk. Everyone knew it was a lie, but everyone pretended it was true. This was the hyper-normalization. But the cracks were getting too big to ignore. In the grocery stores, the shelves were being arranged to hide the empty space. Cans of sea kale, a product nobody wanted, were stacked in pyramids to simulate abundance. In the hospitals, doctors were reusing syringes because of shortages, quietly spreading hepatitis and HIV. In the warm kitchens, the conversation had changed. It wasn't just grumbling about the weather anymore. It was a darker, more cynical humor. They told jokes like, "What is the difference between the dollar and the ruble? A dollar is a piece of paper backed by gold. A ruble is a piece of paper backed by tanks. What happens if the Sahara Desert becomes communist? Nothing for 50 years, and then there will be a shortage of sand." This humor was a defense mechanism. It was the sound of a population losing its fear. And for a totalitarian regime, the loss of fear is more dangerous than a falling oil price. When the people laugh at the tank loses its power. As the winter of 1985 approached, closing out this cursed year, the Soviet Union was a hollow shell. The military was demoralized by a secret war. The economy was hooked on foreign loans and grain. The infrastructure was freezing. The youth were dancing to banned music, and the leadership was busy fighting a war against vodka. The experts in the West, the CIA analysts, and the pundits on TV looked at the map and saw a red monolith. They counted the missiles and the tanks and said, "This power will last for decades." They were wrong. They were looking at the armor, not the body inside. The body was already dead. The terminal diagnosis had been delivered in the frozen apartments of Podolsk, in the radioactive steam of Chazhma Bay, and in the blood-soaked dirt of the Maravar Pass. All that was left was for the final blow to land, the blow that would shatter the illusion forever. Gorbachev thought the worst was behind him. He thought 1986 would be the year his reforms truly took hold. He thought Uskureny would start to pay off. He was planning his next moves, his next speeches. He didn't know that in a little-known town in Ukraine, at a power plant named after Vladimir Lenin, a group of engineers were planning a safety test for late April. He didn't know that the oil traders in Riyadh were about to open the spigots. He didn't know that 1985 hadn't been the year of recovery. It had been the year the fuse was lit. And as the snow began to fall on Red Square again, covering the tracks of the black limousines, the countdown had already begun.
6 years. That's all that was left. But really, it was over already. It is the night of December 31st, 1985. The snow is falling on Red Square, coating the cobblestones in a silence that feels heavy, almost suffocating. Inside millions of Soviet living rooms, the lights are dimmed, the families are gathered around the table. There is Olivier salad, there is champagne, perhaps obtained after hours of queuing, and on the television screen, the face of Mikhail Gorbachev appears. He looks young, he looks confident. He speaks to the nation not as a dying patriarch, but as a man of action. He tells the Soviet people that the worst is behind them. He promises acceleration. He promises sobriety. He promises peace. He tells them that 1986 will be the year the reforms finally bear fruit, the year the socialist dream is revitalized. It was a beautiful lie. Gorbachev didn't know that as he spoke, the reactor in Chernobyl, RBMK 1000 Unit 4, was already ticking toward its April date with destiny. He didn't know that the safety culture which had blown the lid off the submarine at Chazhma Bay was present in every control room in the Union. He didn't know that the oil traders in Riyadh and London were about to crash the price of crude to under $10 a barrel, stripping the empire of the hard currency it needed to buy grain. He didn't know that the empire had already suffered its fatal stroke. 1985 was not the recovery room. It was the hospice. The thesis of this history is simple, but terrifying. 1985 was the year the Soviet Union died. It would just take 6 more years for the body to hit the floor. Everything that would destroy the USSR in 1991 had its genesis, or its point of no return, in these 12 months.
Look at this structure. The heating failure in Podolsk wasn't just about cold radiators. It was the physical proof that the Stalinist infrastructure, the pipes and power plants built in the 1930s and 40s, had reached the end of its warranty simultaneously. The state had spent decades building missiles instead of fixing pipes. By 1985, the physical plant of the Soviet Union was rotting from the inside out, and the cost to fix it was money they no longer had. Look at the economy. The scissors crisis of 1985 was the mathematical proof of death. The country was addicted to high oil prices and foreign grain. When Gorbachev launched the anti-alcohol campaign, he didn't just annoy drinkers, he voluntarily destroyed the state's internal revenue stream right as the external revenue stream, oil, was drying up. He cut the financial arteries of the state in a misguided attempt to cure its moral soul. By the time they tried to reverse the alcohol policies, the inflation genie was out of the bottle, and the black market had swallowed the consumer economy whole. Look at the military. The slaughter at Maravar Pass proved that the Red Army, the terror of NATO, could be bled white by guerrillas in sandals.
The zinc coffins returning to the Black Tulip transport planes in 1985 broke the silent contract between the people and the army. When mothers were told their sons died of food poisoning instead of combat, the moral legitimacy of the state evaporated. You can repress a population that fears you. You cannot govern a population that despises you for lying about their dead children. And look at the culture. The Genes Index and the banned music lists showed that the Soviet idea had lost the future. When a teenager is willing to pay a month's salary for American denim, the ideological war is over. The Komsomol wasn't fighting neo-fascism in AC/DC lyrics. They were fighting the inevitable globalization of culture, and they were losing.
By the time the clock struck midnight on that New Year's Eve, the Soviet Union was no longer a superpower. It was a hollow shell held together by momentum and the KGB. The tragedy is in the human cost of this denial. The sailors vaporized at Chazhma Bay were erased from history for nearly a decade, their families left with questions that were treasonous to ask. The residents of Shkodovo 22 lived in a poisoned town, their health sacrificed to maintain the illusion of naval perfection. The vineyards of Moldova and Georgia, bulldozed by zealous bureaucrats in the summer of '85, took decades to recover. Some ancient varieties were lost forever. That wasn't just economic damage, it was a scar on the cultural memory of those republics, a grievance that would fuel the nationalist independence movements that eventually tore the map apart. And what of the Mikhail Somov, the icebreaker trapped at the bottom of the world? It was eventually freed, the ice cracked, the ship sailed home to a hero's welcome. It was a propaganda victory. But it was the wrong lesson. The Soviet leadership looked at the Somov and thought, see, we can survive anything. We can outlast the ice. They were wrong. The ice of history is not so forgiving. If you go to Moscow today, or Kyiv, or Tbilisi, you can still see the scars of 1985. You see them in the Khrushchevka apartment blocks that are finally being demolished, the ones that froze in that terrible winter. You see them in the graveyards, where the dates on the headstones of young men cluster around 1985 and 1986, the Zinc Boys of Afghanistan. You see them in the geography of the post-Soviet space, where borders were drawn not by logic, but by the frantic collapse of an economic system that lost its ability to pay its bills.
We often look for the single moment when an empire falls. We look for the storming of the Bastille, the sacking of Rome, the lowering of the flag over the Kremlin in December 1991. But history rarely happens in a single explosion. It happens in the quiet failures. It happens in the burst pipe that nobody fixes. It happens in the ledger entry where the debt exceeds the income. It happens in the silence of a hospital room where a leader takes his last breath and the men around him decide to elect a reformer who believes he can save a corpse by telling it to stand up and run. 1985 was the year the machinery finally snapped. It was the year of the invisible catastrophe. Gorbachev finished his speech, the cameras cut away, the Soviet anthem played. The people raised their glasses of champagne, or samagon, or cologne, and drank to the new year. They toasted to new happiness. They didn't know that the check had already been written, and there was nothing left in the bank to pay it. They didn't know they were drinking to the end of the world. And outside, in the dark, the snow kept falling on the statue of Lenin, burying the past, layer by silent layer, while the future waited 6 years away, holding a hammer.